presentation is on an Iraqi novel written by an Iraqi novelist. Iraq War, Repercussions, Trauma, Fantasy, and Violence in Ahmed Sadawi's Frankenstein in Baghdad. This novel was published in 2013, and it won the International Poker Prize, the Arab International Poker Prize in 2014. In this paper or presentation, I will focus on violence and the trauma and the idea of fantasy, which is very important. My aim is, in this paper, is to reveal how Sadawi presents trauma as an aftermath that changes people's life from worst to worst, from war to trauma, and from trauma to violence. Second, to argue also that the traumatic aftermath of the war results in a continuous cycle of violence, and specifically this violence started after the occupation and it intensifies after the sectarian conflict between Sunnis and Shias in Iraq. Third, to discuss these three main issues in slightly detailed way. Just a brief synopsis about the novel. The novel deals primarily with a character whose name is Hadi al-Attaq. He's a Baghdadi man who's a crab dealer. He buys old stuff from people and he sells it. And this image, or this photo, is taken from Google. All the images are taken from Google. Before the war, he used to sell and buy scraps. And after the occupation, just like another image of scrap dealers. After the war, his friend Nahim Abadki was killed in an explosion in Baghdad, and his body parts were mixed with the pavement, and it was burnt and torn. His flesh is mixed with his horse's meat after the explosion. They work together, and they have a cart, a horse, and just like a wagon, they use to put the stuff and roam the streets of Baghdad buying and selling the stuffs. And the main incident in the novel is this traumatic incident that happened to Nahim, Hadi's friend. Hadi's job becomes collecting the bodily parts. This is after the death of his friend. The body parts of the victims of the explosions. He collects, he goes to the places of the explosions, and he picks up the body parts of the victims, putting them in a sack bag and taking them home, and there he stitches these bodily parts of the victims to make a human body out of these bodily parts of the victims. Why? The question is why he did that. He wants to give a very respected burial, burying for the victims, because most of the victims after the occupation, they were just torn into pieces, and there was not, most of them, there were no whole body found after the explosions, and the image of Hadi's friend is there fixed in his mind. This is why it is just like a tribute to all the victims in Iraq, and specifically to his friend, to stitch the body, that is called Frankenstein later on, to stitch the body and give him later on a respected burial. From another side, a young guard who was guarding a hotel in Baghdad, his name is Hasib. He was killed by an explosion. And after his death, the cell of Hasib goes to reside in this body of Frankenstein all of a sudden, which is just a fantastical twist by the writer. So it goes after it has this soul of Hasib in this stitched body, it goes out of control of the creator. The Baghdad Frankenstein starts the mission of killing all responsible for the explosions in Baghdad. So as a victim, or as mixed parts of victims, these victims in this stitched Frankenstein seek the revenge against the responsible people who do the explosions. That Baghdadi Frankenstein kills the bad people at the beginning of the novel, but later on, because whenever he kills those responsible for the explosions, one of his body parts fall down. So he needs to do what? To kill another criminal, and then takes what part of this body and put it. And this happens later on. So in one of the occasions, will come later. Later on, even he kills the innocent people in order to what? To stay alive with the passage of time. This is just a brief synopsis, and then we come to the main issues, which is trauma, fantasy, and violence. Trauma, this is very general. Trauma is more frequently used to denote a psychological state resulting from a particular event, with the event itself subsequently indicated by the use of the same word. The word registers an emotional shock resulting from a significant physical or psychological dislocation, unexpected, unpleasant, over which the subject has no control. What is most important about trauma, it describes an event and its impact later on. And this is what happened in the novel. The event of the explosion that happened to Hadi's friend is described, and how he gets shocked, traumatized, and this trauma lives with him at the present. So the past will live with him at the present, and continually he will remember what happened to the body, to the bodily burnt parts of his friend. So it describes an event and its impact, or rather an event in terms of its impact. The traumatic event, which is the primary source and cause of trauma, and its eventual aftermath, are two essentially different things. The traumatic event is in the past, whereas the aftermaths come later after the event. The aftermath may be a psychological shock that may change the person's point of view of life and people, and majorly of himself. According to Hadi's state, the protagonist's state, the trauma stems from the way people suffer after the war. He observes that these victims are blown to pieces by the unstoppable explosions in Baghdad, and never have the courtesy of being given a decent and respected burial. The death of Nahim, his friend, in the explosion makes Hadi decide to create his Frankenstein. Hadi's main trauma comes from Nahim's sudden and horrible death in the explosion. The whole novel is a kind of Hadi's wrestling with that trauma, and how he tries to compensate for the bodily parts of his best friend by collecting the bodily parts of similar innocent victims. The main traumatic event of the death of Nahim is finished, but its repercussions on Hadi push him to make his Frankenstein. And this is very important in terms of Hadi's state. What is important is that Hadi's perspectives on life after the event of the explosion to happen to his friend are changed. I agree, for me, with Severe Parvin, one of the critics, who said that trauma is nevertheless not necessarily by its nature a permanent impediment to a mature development. Trauma, in this case, does not stop the development and the recovery of the traumatized people. Some may manage to integrate the experiences and find adjustments in spite of the injuries experienced. Some traumatized people, they may cope with the idea of remembering the traumatic experiences. Others will have long-lasting disabilities and adjustment problems. Other people who are traumatized, they cannot. They always live in the past, and the past live in their present, and it becomes part of their everyday life. For almost all, however, a trauma will never be forgotten, and this is what happens to the protagonist Hadi here. He never forgets what happened to his friend, and he keeps it in his memory and mind. Sa'dawi, the author, does not focus only on Hadi's traumatic experience. So we have this main traumatic experience of his friends, I mean the protagonist's friend's death, and we have another traumatic experience. Rather, he stresses the state of living in trauma for other characters in the novel. Alishwa, who is a Christian woman and a widow, who has lost her son Daniel in the Iraq-Iran war. This is also taken from Google just to represent the Christian minority in Iraq. She lives with her memories of her lost son and lives not for herself but for the hope of his returning back to life again. Saadawi, the author, makes her live with her past more than living her present. She lives with her old cat, Nabu, in hope of Daniel's return one day. Daniel disappeared 20 years ago as a soldier in the Iraqi army at that time of conflict. His disappearance creates a trauma of loss for Alishwa, and she continues to live in her house with her old cat only. All her daughters left Iraq to Australia for fear of their life, and they ask her to join them, but she refuses. And this is, the author, the novelist, expresses this idea that the minority of Christians in Iraq, most of them, after these continuous wars, they leave Iraq, okay? Because they feel afraid for themselves. They feel maybe targeted, maybe they lose their lives in these wars and experiences. This is why they leave. So Alishwa is left by herself with nobody except her cat. This image is also from Google, just to give you an idea of what happens to mosques and churches inside Iraq. So Alishwa thinks that Daniel will come back to her one day. Her trauma is mainly caused by a Baptist man called Abu Zaydoun. He's a comrade, as we call it in Iraq. He used to arrest the soldiers who deserved their duty of serving in the army. He arrested her son Daniel from that time. Daniel never comes back. The Frankenstein, created by Hadi, stitches together, comes to Alishwa, and she thinks that he's Daniel. So when he knocks at the door, she thinks that her son is coming back to life. But this is the Frankenstein of Baghdad. This is why she lets him stay in her house. Shisma, it is called more than one name in the novel. It is called What's Its Name, and the Frankenstein, and Criminal X by the Iraqi authorities. So Shisma kills Abu Zaydoun, the man who is responsible for her son's death, to make Alishwa happy. Alishwa plays a major role in the novel as a representative of the Christian Iraqis whose existence was threatened as a minority group in Iraq by the Iraq-Iran war and the aftermath of the 2003 war. Their trauma is collective in terms of being a minority which faces the disastrous consequences of the wars as traumatic events. Frankenstein, there is an idea that this Frankenstein is a kind of, not only a revenger, he's a kind of a savior. Why? Because he kills these people who are responsible for the deaths of Iraqis. In one of the interviews, Saadawi, the author, he states that another way of reading the novel is that the monster, the Frankenstein, represents the savior, given his desire to take revenge on behalf of all victims. Bringing justice to the increasing number of victims in Iraq today means salvation for everyone. So there is an idea that maybe Iraqis will be saved by some supernatural power or fantastical power that will kill and take revenge, seek revenge on all those responsible people who make explosions. Here we sense a reflection of the metaphysical vision of the idea of salvation, though it is questioned in the novel, because the Avenger, Frankenstein, later on he turns to be from killing the responsible people who are criminals to killing also innocent human beings. So at the end he will become what? Just like the comrades, okay? He will be also a criminal. The Shisma or Frankenstein tries to spread justice and salvation. He is shown as a Christian. Later in the novel, his followers make him think of himself as, quote, a leader, a saint, a Jesus, the savior and the awaited, who was sent by God to save the Iraqis, as the What's His Name puts it. The idea of salvation and saving people is not accomplished by the government of Iraq, or the occupying forces. Rather, the novelist Saadawi puts it in the hands of the Shisma or Frankenstein because of the incapability of the former to establish a stable state after the war. The author wants to say that the status quo of violence in Iraq reveals the incapability of state power or the Americans to stop the cycle of killing and chaos. As a result, he stresses fantasy through creating his Frankenstein as a redeeming counterpower to compensate for that lack of control and mainly of being, and mainly to bring justice. Here we have the book covers of Mary Shelley's novel and Ahmed Saadawi's Frankenstein in Baghdad. So another issue that I want to stress beside trauma is the idea of fantasy. Mary Shelley and Saadawi's novel, in terms of fantasy, Saadawi doesn't base his novel on Mary Shelley's novel Frankenstein. Rather, he asserts in an interview that, quote, there are only 2 references to Frankenstein in the novel. Apart from these 2 references, the people of the Baghdad in the novel call the strange monster the what's its name, because they don't know what the name of this monster, or the one who doesn't have a name. And perhaps it doesn't concern them whether it looks like Frankenstein or not. What is important is that he gets revenge against the criminals. And perhaps it doesn't concern them whether it looks like Frankenstein or not. In any case, Frankenstein in Baghdad deals with a different theme from that of Shelley's Frankenstein. Frankenstein in this novel is a condensed symbol of Iraq's current problems. The Frankensteinesque atmosphere of horror was strongly prevalent in Iraq during the period covered by the novel. What does this mean? What people look at, I mean the Iraqis, after these explosions, they want justice. But neither the occupation forces nor the government can bring justice to the families of the victims. They believe, this is why they believe that there should be a superpower and fantastical power to do this job. There are many differences between the 2 novels, the themes, the characters, ambitions, the results of their actions. The main similarity is the idea of revenge in both novels. Though each Frankenstein in these 2 novels uses its own way of revenge against its enemies, the result is the use of violence and killing. Both characters discover new perspectives about the human nature, life, and the nature of violence. Both novels engage the readers with pessimistic realities that show a dismal picture for the future. So the fantasy twist of giving life to that Frankenstein is very important in the novel because it brings to the fore the surrealism of what is happening to Iraqis every day in the streets, namely being exploded, torn into pieces, and lost. The use of fantasy in the novel is an essential ingredient of the narration because it makes the readers focus on the unstable reality that Iraqis live in. Though it seems difficult to understand or interpret why this happens to Iraqis, and this is one of the main issues. We as Iraqis, we always ask ourselves there back in Iraq, why this is happening to us? Is it because of Saddam? Is it because he is a dictator? Is it because we have done something wrong? There is a question that cannot be answered for us, which is very ambiguous. The author tries to expose that horrible, violent reality by mixing the real with the fantastical. By so doing, he creates a space for the readers to examine the kind of narration that tackles the horrors of the aftermath of the occupation in a surrealistic style. Here, I agree with Rosemary Jackson, who states that, quote, thematically too, the fantastic plays upon difficulties of interpreting events, things as objects or as images, thus disorienting the reader's categorization of the real. The violent reality of Iraq makes Saadawi, the author, reveal it in a fantastical way in order to divulge the dark side of the aftermath of the occupation. though Saadawi never criticizes directly, and this is very important. Is he neutral? Is he objective as a writer? Though Saadawi never criticizes directly in his novel The Occupying Forces, but it is quite clear from the narration that he touches upon the reasons of the chaotic damage of humans in Iraq. One of the critics, Amani Ali, she asserts that, quote, but in the book the Americans are only mentioned when violence erupts, or when their tanks are retreating to give way for sectarian clashes. This is very important statement. So the American troops, they retreat when there is a sectarian conflict between Sunnis and Shias, as if to give space for what? For more damage, more violence. Their existence is not explicitly described, just strongly felt. In addition, another critic, Jonah Ross, in her book, The Subjectivity of Science Fiction, she writes that, quote, fantasy embodies a negative subjectivity. That is, fantasy is fantasy because it contravenes the real and violates it. The actual world is constantly present in fantasy by negation. Fantasy is what couldn't have happened, that's to say, what cannot happen, what cannot exist. The negative subjectivity, the cannot or couldn't, constitutes in fact the chief pleasure of fantasy. Fantasy violates the real, contravenes it, denies it, and insists on this denial throughout. In this novel, the author, in Saadawi's novel, people die in explosions every day, and there is no punishment for the criminals who kill the innocent people, except through the actions of Frankenstein. In other words, there is no sense of justice except through the existence and the creation of a fantastical creature as Frankenstein. By creating that fantastical character, the author focuses on the real world in his novel to the extent that he wants to show the horrors and abnormality of that reality through the absence of any sense of salvation or order or stability. We said previously that the Frankenstein, he may be a kind of a savior, but later on, because he becomes a criminal, killing innocent people, he no more believed to be a savior. He wants to show that there is no sense of peace, and there needs to be a Frankenstein to solve the dilemma. The novel starts with Hadi's loss, the main character, loss of his best friend, and ends with the arrest of the wrong criminal, Hadi, whereas the real Frankenstein is free. So the creator of the Frankenstein is arrested at the end by the government, thinking that this is the man who kills people. But the real Frankenstein, the actual one, is set free. They cannot do what? They cannot arrest him. The creation of the fantastical Frankenstein is a kind of violating the precepts of what is accepted in society. For the characters, Frankenstein is a monster. On the other hand, another critic, Tuzftan Todorov, insists in his fantastical structural approach to a literary genre, quote, the fantastic requires the fulfillment of three conditions. First, the text must oblige the reader to consider the world of the characters as a world of living persons, and to hesitate between a natural and supernatural explanation of the events described. And this is what Saadawi, the author, did. He mixes the real with the unreal. We believe that this Frankenstein is composed of real people dead, but his actions are what? His movement. The soul that enters his body, is it real or not? We have some sort of skepticism about this. Second, this hesitation may also be experienced by a character. Thus, the reader's role is entrusted to a character. The hesitation is represented. This is why character in the novel, some of them they believe in that Frankenstein, some of them they don't. This is why Hadi, the main character, He comes to the cafe of his Egyptian friend and he tells that he has created a Frankenstein and he will be the savior. So some people in the cafe, they believe in him, and some people, they say he is a liar. Because where is that Frankenstein? They cannot see him as a real identity. It becomes one of the themes of the work. Third, the reader must adopt a certain attitude with regard to the text. He will reject allegorical as well as poetic interpretations. I will come to the final and last issue, which is violence in the novel. One of the critics, Samira Azmir, asserts in her The Violence of Nonviolence, Law and War in Iraq, quote, the 2003 war against Iraq is said by some of those who waged it and others who supported it to have partly deployed violence to build a nation. One of what we have here as Iraqis in the media before the war and at the beginning of the war, that they will topple Saddam and suppress democracy in Iraq. We will have freedom, human rights, to have partly deployed violence to build a nation, to institute democracy, and to deliver Iraqis from dehumanized past. It is true. They topple Saddam, but in which way? They use which tool? The tool of what? Of violence that is left after the occupation. There is no control of what is going on in Iraq in terms of the stability of the country. Here, this slide also is taken from Google. This is an image, just to give you an image about the explosions that happens in Iraq, how blood it flows in the streets of Baghdad and Iraq, mixed with water after that. The third issue that Sardawi focuses on in the novel is violence. The chaotic state of Iraq makes Sardawi manipulate fantasy as a tool to delineate the horror, extremity, and abnormality of violence taking place in Iraq after 2003 war. Violence is the distinctive feature of Iraq's state after the occupation. It means killing, damage, threatening, and creating terror in others who are innocent. What the author creates is a Frankenstein that turns against both the criminals and innocent people, because the moment he kills his victim, part of his body falls. This is why he needs to replace it with a new bodily part from another new victim. The Baghdadi Frankenstein starts as a revenger on criminals, but ends as a criminal himself. This sheds light on the chaotic and ambiguous killing of innocent Iraqis after the war. Another critic, Tim Arango, in his Baghdad is a setting, he states, quote, the body referred to as Shisma, Frankenstein, an Arabic word meaning what's his name, eventually kills innocents too, reflecting the madness and moral ambiguities of the war and its aftermath. This proves that violence brings violence, and by so doing, the cycle of violence will not stop. Killing will not stop, and victims will continue to be torn apart by unknown Frankensteins who roam the streets of Baghdad without punishment. And commenting on the nature of violence, Judith Butler, one of the scholars, she asserts in her book Precarious Life, violence is surely a touch of the worst order, a way a primary human vulnerability to other humans is exposed in its most terrifying way, a way in which we are given over without control to the will of another, a way in which life itself can be expunged by the willful action of another. To the extent that we commit violence, we are acting on another, putting the other at risk, causing the other damage, threatening to expunge the other. The vulnerability of Iraqis in the face of terrorists and killers creates an atmosphere of chaos that couldn't be controlled at that time by neither the government nor not the occupying forces. And here my last, just to give you an image of one of the explosions that happened in Iraq. So the victims in Iraq, after most of the explosions, they are killed just like that, okay? Burnt and cut into pieces. just like any other scrap after the explosion. In addition, what was happening in Iraq after the war is the targeting of people by car bombs, explosions, kidnapping, and assassination. The terrorists used different methods of killing Iraqis. There was a shadow of death everywhere because of the incapability of the government and the coalition forces to know who is behind these horrible killings. In this context, I agree with one of the critics, Sultan Barakat, who asserts that, quote, the violence in Iraq is not solely an issue of security, but also one of governance and credibility. Both the Iraq government and the troops were not able to safeguard the innocent Iraqis being killed nearly every day in the streets by car bombings. In addition, the sectarian conflict between Shiites and Sunnis brought murders and created a state of fear and the threat that continued for years. The author focuses on such a kind of atmosphere in Iraq and tries to reveal how violence eradicates Hadi's belief in a safe and peaceful Baghdad. Hadi's friend's death in one of Baghdad's explosions makes him change his views of the value of human beings in Iraq. The body of his friend was burnt in the explosion, and Hadi and people found only burnt and torn bodily parts of his friend. The atrocious death that his friend faces leads to Hadi's thinking of collecting the torn bodily parts of the explosions victims from the streets of Baghdad and makes out of them his Baghdadi Frankenstein. Just to go to the conclusion, to conclude, Saadawi's Frankenstein in Baghdad brings the traumatic past with the violent present in a fantastical style. I think that he succeeds in staging the heroes of both eras, the past under Saddam power and the present under the hammer of conflicting groups. What he wants to convey is that Iraq may need a superpower to save it from the dilemma of his present violence. Iraq, in the novel, is a stage of conflicts, whether between Brigadier Surur, he's a representative of the Iraqi government, and his search for what's its name, and its search and targeting of criminals, or Farad's, one of the characters, search for new acquisition of houses. His state agents, whenever there is a family